Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film The Tale of the Princess Kaguya. This is the first film from Isao Takahata in 14 years. It is considered his swan song or final film. He hasn't really said he's retiring or that this will be his final film, but based on how old he is and how long it's taken to make just this film, I think that's probably a safe bet, but who knows with Takahata. He's been around in the Japanese animation industry for so long, I kind of hope he stays around forever, but that's probably wishful thinking. This is a project he has wanted to make for a long time. It is based on a 10th century Japanese folktale, which is considered to be Japan's oldest folktale. And Takahata had actually helped work on a previous animated attempt at making The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, but that didn't actually get made. And so this is a film and a story that he's liked for quite some time. Takahata, in his later years, for a lot of his time in the animation industry, has wanted to do things that animation has never done and get animation taken more seriously. And at this point in his career, he's really achieved all of that. He's probably, other than Hayao Miyazaki, probably the second most famous Japanese animation director of all time. I can't think of very many people who are as well known as him and Miyazaki, and this started probably the most successful studio in Japanese animation and in animation history in general. I've noticed with both this and The Wind Rises, there are two films of directors who, they're both dream projects, they're both projects they really wanted to do their own way, and they're actually going to be released at the same time, just like My Neighbor Totoro and Grave of the Fireflies, but they decided not to do that. I guess that was just the planning stages. The similarity is not just because they're both of their last films. I think it's almost like they don't care as much about appealing to an audience. They're not films that they care as much about making money on. This film had a ridiculous budget. I think it was like $40 million. It's almost like they've achieved this success, and if they're going to go out, they want to do their dream project like a usual auteur does their dream project. This feels more like a messier auteur's dream project than The Wind Rises did. They both do kind of feel like that in certain regards, but I think The Tale of Princess Kaguya is more of the kind of project that you'd only do if you knew you probably weren't going to make another film. This film follows the Princess Kaguya as she is discovered by a bamboo cutter living in the forest, and he sees a glowing bamboo tree, he cuts it and finds a tiny infant in there, and then begins to raise this baby with his wife. The baby, Kaguya, very quickly grows, and he knows that she's a princess right away because of how beautiful she is, and they raise her as their own, and she's called Little Bamboo by the children in the Japanese countryside, and she grows up very, very quickly, but then eventually the bamboo cutter finds another glowing bamboo tree filled with gold and is able to buy a very nice estate more in the city and try to get Kaguya, who is growing more and more into a beautiful woman, to be married by a very well-respected man. It has more of a hand-drawn and watercolor style in this film, which is a lot more aggressively different than what most animators would do, but I think that's what makes Takahata such an amazing animation director, is he's never really stayed with the same character design. If you look at Grave of the Fireflies and then My Neighbor the Yamadas and Hall's Prince of the Sun, some of those is a natural evolution, some of those is just not to be too stale, and this is a very different kind of film for him. It's not entirely literal all the time. It very much sometimes feels like a very old story. It doesn't feel like a 20th century story. But Isao Takahata still understands how to make a character work and someone that an audience can follow throughout a story. Kaguya definitely plays that role throughout this film, and I had a deep attachment to her as an audience. I could follow her through a plot that feels episodic in some ways, that doesn't feel entirely connected in some parts, and actually differs from the original story that this is based on. It has a lot more to do with the Emperor, who has a much smaller role in this film than he does in the original story, but I don't think that really would have worked. I liked her big romance was with the boy she knew from the Japanese countryside before, than the Emperor, who seems to kind of come out of nowhere. But the whole thing with the moon felt really abrupt when it happened, but since I had such an attachment to Kaguya and her adoptive parents, I kind of eventually just went with it. A story from the 10th century, clearly there wasn't a story writing book at that time to have like rules of writing and things like that. Not to say that stories now are better written because we have that necessarily, but there's a certain structure to things that this story just really does not have whatsoever in certain points, and it can be a little rough to get through because of that. It is the longest Studio Ghibli film ever made. It's 137 minutes. Because this story has so many things, like the beginning thing with the countryside, them getting rich, her try and become like this well-studied woman. The whole thing with the 5 suitors was a little bizarre, and kind of going through all those things. Throughout that, you have things like her wanting to go back to the countryside, not liking being rich, kind of really help the story throughout it. He doesn't try to make this more contemporized. It's not very much a 20th century story at all, and he doesn't try to pretend like it is or adapt it like it is, which I actually kind of like that he did that. I mean, it is a 10th century story, but the way he adapted it felt like a previous century story, not a 20th centuries at all. And I'd say a lot of his films and a lot of Ghibli's films feel like 20th century stories. Not that I'm holding that against them, but I thought it was an interesting way to go. Some of the animation almost felt like Winsor McKay and older, very early animation, rather than what you really expect from Takahata. The kind of sketchier watercolor style in some places, especially she has a dream at a certain point, feels really kinetic and has a lot of energy to it that you really wouldn't get from mainstream animation now. Feels so controlled and constrained and has to have all the CG character designs look the same, and then suddenly you have this kind of almost, I guess the best animator who's like that is like Bill Plimpton. It just feels like kind of this raging, crazed sequence. And there are a lot of sequences where he kind of lets go of reality. Maybe it's weird for a director like Takahata, who's very known for kind of a neo-realistic style, and bringing that to animation and having a film that really lets go of reality. How versatile a filmmaker Takahata was. That's the thing that's probably most surprising about this, because if you think of My Neighbor the Yamadas, which was his last film, that was very much centered more so in reality. This film is all over the place, and that's kind of what's so beautiful about it. The music of this film is by Joe Hisaishi, whose name I'm not pronouncing right, but he's usually Hayao Miyazaki's film composer, and he's never worked with Takahata before. One thing I noticed about it, usually his scores feel kind of all over the place but somehow work, which is always kind of really amazing and interesting. But in this film it felt a lot more consistent. I've noticed when his later, more recent scores, he has a lot more consistency than he did in something like Nausicaa. He really helps as well with the character of Kaguya to have a good through line through it. I'm not going to say that this is a film I feel as passionate about as The Wind Rises or a lot of Takahata's films. It's one of the most beautiful 2D animated films I've seen in a very long time. Not even talking about storytelling or anything, just on the animation alone, it's a visual feast to behold. It's one of the most beautiful, credible, kinetic, crazed animated films I've probably seen this year, and it has a style all its own that you can't control and can't be controlled, and Takahata lets it do that, and I love that about it. And it's good enough that if we're just talking about animation, not talking about story, it's one of the best of the year. But if I'm talking about story and the film overall, I don't think it lives up to, you know, Takahata's better work. I think it's a very ambitious dream project that he's always wanted to do, and it feels like a dream project. But dream projects are messy and weird and strange, that aren't entirely the kind of film that you're going to love that director for. I know this isn't like a Gangs of New York type failure or something like that, but I would not show this film to someone if they're not familiar with Takahata's work. This is not the film that's going to get you into Studio Ghibli. It's not very accessible, to be honest with you. If you're into Studio Ghibli, I think you'll like it, and you'll like the different style to it. It's a very strange, weird animated movie. I mean, it's still accessible because Studio Ghibli, I think, like, can't not be. He doesn't go completely off the rails or anything, and he does adapt it in a certain way. He lets go of some things like the Emperor character and makes it work more as a movie. I kind of feel like maybe he should have toned down the 10th century-ness of it a little bit more. I feel like that came out a little too much, still having it have this random episodic nature to it, which Studio Ghibli itself has had work in several other movies very well, but I didn't feel like it worked as well in this film. Sometimes they don't feel like a typical structure of a film, and it works out very well, but I don't think this is as good of an example of that. But it's still a beautiful, amazing dream project by one of the greatest animation directors of all time. And that's something I think that is an amazing feat to behold, and it's certainly a visual masterpiece. And it's sad to see a Takahata go. While I was watching it, I wasn't entirely in love with it, but after it was over, I felt like the weight of it. I felt moved and saddened. Both that was a crazy, incredible experience of a movie. That Takahata, that this could be the end of it. As I watched Kaguya go back to the moon, I kind of felt a sense of sadness that I really watched. One of the best directors in film in general of all time going away, and this was the end of it. That made me a little sad. This was his 8th film, his 5th film with Studio Ghibli, and what a remarkable and amazing run. When you look at Takahata, he always wanted to change the perception of animation and take animation further than a lot of directors have. And he does that with this film in a certain regard, and he keeps pushing the boundaries of it, even to the end. Maybe story-wise it wasn't as well conceived and it doesn't show the great storyteller he was, but it shows the great animator and the boundary pusher that he always had been throughout his entire career. So if you have seen The Tale of Princess Kaguya and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And currently I am working on a Studio Ghibli series where I'm trying to review all of the Studio Ghibli films, mostly in order, and the previous films before Studio Ghibli was formed of Isao Takahata and Hayao Miyazaki. And if you would like to watch any of those videos, I have a review playlist which will have an annotation below or right in front of you right now. And if you click on that, you can watch any of those. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.